Hello everyone, Dr. Feist here with Dr. Strange, back to talk to you about, the Nicomachean Ethics. So we're now moving into Book 2. Book 1 gave us a huge overview. If you haven't watched that, go back and look at, I did a bunch of videos on Book 1. In Chapter 1 of Book 2, recall we have our arche of ethics, our starting point. And the whole game here is to look at what Eudaimonia means, and it's connected up to this good, this agathos. So the Eudaimonia, we're trying to unpack it. That's the whole goal of the Nicomachean Ethics, is to unpack this notion of a kind of happiness, good life, Eudaimonia. Again, don't run to a translation. Try and think in terms of this as a different concept that we really don't quite have in English. So happiness is sometimes used, well-being, flourishing. They've all captured part of it, but don't regard any of them as a perfect translation. So what roughly we've got to is this starting point of ethics. This starting point, it's the activity. So eudaimonia is an active form of sort of participating in life, and it's the activity of distinctly human psyche, human soul, in accordance with the best, most complete arete. So arete is a key term that Aristotle is going to talk about a lot in Book 2, actually Books 3 and so on. So arete will dominate Aristotle's discussion, and there will be some tensions throughout, and we'll look at those as we go along. But for now, because we're talking about something distinctly human in connection with the psyche or the soul, remember for Aristotle, psyche is a very broad term. So activities of psyche are things like respiration, all kinds of things that Aristotle would have noticed that animals do, sensation, things like that, and what plants do, like nutrition and growth. So psyche is a broad term, and because we're talking about an agathos that's connected, remember, it has to all deal with us, with the human notion of a good. It's going to be distinctly human. And what's distinctly human? Well, it's going to be linked to what's distinct about us, is that we're reasoning types of creatures. Now, how it's linked, there's going to be certain kind of distinctly human psyche activities, right, that are going to be classified as directly linked to reason and indirectly. When it's directly, he's going to be talking about things like the intellectual virtues or intellectual arete. Those come about and are fostered and developed through time and teaching and experience, Aristotle said. But that's like study, academic kind of stuff. The other things that he's going to talk about with regards to the activities of psyche, activities of soul, is will be the character virtues. The character arete, if you will. And character, the Greek term for that is ethos, which is essentially an ethos, like your characters are products of habit. And Aristotle notes that the term ethos for character is very close to the term for habit, ethos. And today we often talk about the ethos of an environment, a way of thinking, what's the ethos here? A way of thinking, a way of acting, and how you're supposed to be, what kind of character you have to have in order to fit in. So most of his discussion, pretty well all of it, until a couple of books later, will really all be about the character virtues. But we really haven't talked yet about what even virtue really is. So Aristotle begins his discussion by noting a few things. He says, the character arete, these are products of habit. So you develop them through habits. Now, what can you and what can you not develop through habits? That's an important thing to consider with Aristotle. And he gives an example. He says, look, think about a stone. It's got a certain nature or an essence or fundamental way that it is. How can you change that? Well, you can't change a stone via habituation. What's his example? Well, what is a stone? What's its natural thing to do is to fall. Right? In other words, if you leave a stone alone, it will drop, and in Aristotle's view, it will head towards its natural resting place, which is with the other stones in the dirt, essentially on the earth. That's what stones do. So you can't change that via habituation. In other words, you can't teach a stone or train a stone. You can shape it in a variety of ways with tools, but you can't change the stone to do other things than it does. It will always fall. So Aristotle gives the example, if you throw the stone up in the air repeatedly, 1,000 times, well, on the 1,001st time, it's going to do the exact same thing that it did on the first time. It's going to fall. So you cannot change it via habituation. But some aspects of us can be changed via habituation. So he's looking at how can we change ourselves through habit. You can't really change much about certain activities of your soul, like respiration and things like that through habit, although you can improve your health through exercise. But the fact of respiration or these kinds of things is really not something you can change. So Aristotle is looking right at the beginning and presupposing that there are things about us that we can change. And that's going to be how we will develop our characters. And key thing, they're products of habit. So they're things you have to do in order to change yourself. So we can be habituated in a variety of ways. He also says, look, think about good and evil. The old question, are we naturally good? Are we naturally evil? What do philosophers say? Well, in general, it's hard to say what philosophers say in general, but Aristotle does give us an answer. He says, look, we can be habituated either way. You can train people to be good. You can train them to be evil. So this is a matter of training. Aristotle points this out in numerous places. You're not born either way. You're born more or less with a capacity. So with regards to good and evil, you're really born with capacities. In other words, you have a capacity to become good or evil. So you can be trained in either direction. Now, Aristotle a little later on will say there are kinds of inclinations towards things. He recognizes that. He doesn't think we're completely born as blank slates, just a pure capacity that could be run off in one direction or another. Because some people may be a little bit more inclined to one side of this or the other. But his point is that it can be handled through training. You can be habituated. Unlike a stone, you can't habituate a stone into being other than doing its stone-like things. But humans are different. We're malleable. And that, of course, is all connected to our relationship with reason. And it's indirectly with respect to the character virtues. So that's an important thing, that you don't just sort of think your way into being a good person. You have to do something that is a habit. You become good by doing good stuff. You don't just imagine or think your way into being good. So then character virtues, they don't arise in us via nature. We have to do something. Nature just provides us with, as I said, capacities. So we can be changed via habituations. And when something does arise in us, from nature, we get it as something that's just actualized. It's a potential form. So Aristotle says if you're wondering like what we're actually really born with, that's not just a mere capacity. Something we're born with also are things that, in certain things that are, you could say, potentials or impotentia. In other words, like vision. The baby is born and it doesn't have to practice vision in order to see. It just opens its eyes and it actualizes this capacity to see. We don't have that with respect to things like good and evil. You don't just simply actualize it. You have to develop it. So with the character virtues, it is much like becoming a musician. You have the capacity to become a musician, but you got to train, you got to learn, and you become musical by playing music, and you get better at it. So there's this notion of the training up of the skills in music, just like there is the training up in the skills that we would say are character virtues. So you can think of virtues as kind of like skills, in a sense. They're dispositions, they're tendencies of the soul. So if you train poorly, you'll become a poor musician. If you train poorly in your character virtues, well, then you're going to become, maybe a bad person or not such a nice person after all. And if you're trained well, then you're going to become a good person. And this reflects ordinary speech by when we say somebody was well brought up, or somebody was poorly raised, or we often, when we look at people's behavior that we, let's say, think is blameworthy or not terribly impressive, we do wonder, like, geez, where did that person come from? What did his parents do to him or her? So Aristotle is basically picking up on a very common way of talking. All right, and again, nobody teaches us how to breathe. You just start breathing. Nobody teaches you how to see. So there are lots of things we're born with, and other things that Aristotle wants to talk about. They're the ones we develop. Okay, so Aristotle makes a few points to conclude chapter 1. You hang around with, because the training up of the individual, the training up of the system, the training up of the child is so important, he stresses early childhood development. You hang around with good people, chances are you're going to become good. You increase the odds. It's not a perfect given. You have to want to do it. There's personal responsibility. But if you hang around with good people, you watch what they do, you copy what they do, you are basically habituating yourself towards good. You hang around with rogues, you pick up on their habits, you start doing that, you're going to habituate yourself through to evil. And this, of course, agrees with a lot of modern psychology that would, certain kinds of terrible behaviors we think might be innate, which would be different than what Aristotle's saying, but a lot of bad behaviors, even things like psychopathy and things like that, sociopathy, we would say, no, those are more conditioned, so we would use the language of conditioning. Aristotle would say, yeah, that's habituation. You can be habituated to behave in terrible things if you hang around with people that do that, or you're raised poorly, etc., etc. So your moral dispositions, the general ways that you behave, they will be partially a product of the company you keep. It's up to you. It's up and people around you to control these environments, to shape these environments in order to shape and create the conditions for good characters to emerge. So once again, ethics in Aristotle goes right into politics because it's all about training. So the broad conditions will be things like the family. We've already seen Aristotle talk about how important that is. But of course, even the broader conditions are laid down in politics because that's exactly what politicians are supposed to do. They're supposed to create the general conditions such that habits that lead towards good characters can exist, creating the proper environments. So ethics, once again, leads right directly, or leads, or whatever term you prefer, right into politics. There's really no distinction here. So the whole notion of doing ethics and politics is really of a piece in Aristotle's view. And as he said numerous times, all this stuff about eudaimonia is really leading up to eudaimonia of the person in a political context. So the legislator, the politician needs to keep all this in mind because that's what you're supposed to be doing when you're in charge in government. Ethics moves seamlessly into politics, and the politician is to try and train people to become good people. So, as Aristotle said, the early years of how you're raised, they don't just make a difference. He says perhaps they make the complete difference, all the difference in the world, he says. So it certainly wasn't Freud who came along and first said, oh, it's all about childhood and all that. No, Aristotle was talking about this. Plato talks about it too. The importance of education. And if you look at Plato's work, probably his most influential document, The Republic. What is that? That's really just an extended tract on education. What kinds of conditions do we want our children to live through such that they develop good habits, they're habituated properly so that they become good citizens? So there's some general remarks. Now, if you recall, when I started these videos, I quoted from the very opening passage of Book 2, Chapter 2. And what's the point of doing all this? Ethics is not an abstract study. It's not metaphysics. Sure, there may be items of metaphysics, as we've seen. Go back and check these out, earlier videos out, that relate metaphysical principles to ethics. But as Aristotle has stressed, and he'll do it time and time again, I'm not even going to point it out because he does it so often in the Nicomachean Ethics. He stresses that ethics is all about learning to become good. Again, it's all about habituation. It's not about just sheer knowledge. Aristotle, in fact, a little later on is going to say knowledge is not that important. Again, stressing that he's not that terribly of an elitist, as some people say, an intellectualist about knowledge. No, it's all about development of your character. Now, what's the point here? Well, the whole thing is to become good. It's to do things. It's to habituate ourselves to become good. So, how do we do this, right? Like, well, okay, it's one thing to say it, but as Aristotle says, it's all about actions. So what are the actions? How do we do it? Well, he's going to give us some, shall we say, some tips. You can think of the Nicomachean Ethics as a how-to book. How do I become a good person? And remember, the notion of becoming a good person is not simply an abstract thing. There's also a big amount of self-interest in it, because you can say, well, what's the point of becoming a good person or being moral? Aristotle says, well, if you do that, remember, it's all about this, eudaimonia, living the good life. So there's a deep link between ethics, being good, and being happy. So those two ideas are quite close in what is commonly referred to the eudaimonistic approach to ethics. The happy, good life is connected to the moral life. So for Aristotle, if you say, well, why should I be moral? He would think that's an odd question. He would say, well, that's like asking, why would I want to be happy? Like, and if you don't want to be happy, Aristotle might say something like, your psyche is broken, or something like that. He would certainly regard it as a strange question, because everybody wants to be happy. Okay, so back to the notion of how we go about this. So what... People say Aristotle doesn't tell us what to do. Well, he does. He tries. Most ethicists tend to shy away from telling you exactly what you should do and run to general principles. Aristotle will deal with general principles, but he'll try to dig down into the weeds of human behavior as well. Okay, so we start off with a general principle. One should act in accordance with a correct principle, a right reason. Right? Now, Aristotle says, this seems to be generally accepted. It's not terribly controversial, but that's what we're going to start with. The notion of acting in accordance with the right reason. He will later unpack as to what all this means later on, what right reason. But it's important to remember that everything is connected either directly or indirectly with reason. That's distinctly what we are. That's the distinct part of the psyche of a human being, is the rational part. And if you want to go deeper into Aristotle's musings on the nature of the psyche, read his work De Anima, which is the Latin translation of psyche, anima, soul. Now, here in this general principle, Aristotle says it's pretty well accepted, and he's going to use it for now, but he'll talk about it later. We start with a general outline, as Aristotle has said earlier, and then we'll flesh it out later. He says also a couple of points about methodology. We've seen him repeat his views on methodology. Ethics isn't exact. Ethics has a different starting point than metaphysics. Ethics doesn't have the same kinds of precision, etc., etc. He points this out again. There's really no perfect ethics in terms of having a perfect science of the individual. This is one of the difficulties, the great difficulties of ethics, is its application. And it's always very easy to talk about general principles, Aristotle says, but when you get right down into the thick of things, when you're looking at a particular case, that's when it gets very difficult. And it's certainly not something that you can say, well, I have a general science of the individual. That's a larger methodological point. There really isn't a science of individuals. Sciences deal with basically general principles. And then the art of things, the difficulties, is trying to adapt them to the particulars. All right, so Aristotle said, okay, despite all this, we have to go further. We have to do what we can, where we can make some sorts of advancements in ethics. We do have to talk about particular situations. Now, let's see what we can do. Aristotle makes a few general observations about the character virtues. But we can't see character virtues in the way, like you can't see dispositions of the soul. All you see are actions. But certain dispositions of the soul, non-character dispositions, you can kind of see, where Aristotle says things like, we can see activities of soul like health or strength. And what he notices is that health and strength, if you think about them, the same things that contribute to health and strength can also be detrimental to them. So, his first observation, if we look at the broad sense of virtue, or arete, the broad sense, the source can be something that develops them or damages them. So the source can be, it can help develop or damage. So, example, an activity of soul like health, Aristotle say, well, that's got its roots in things like food and exercise. So, food and exercise can be good for health, can be good for the body, good for you, etc., etc. Right, but it has to be in the right amount for that person. This is an important observation, because certain amount of food might be right for me in order for me to have good health. If I have too much, I'll get too heavy. If I have too little, I'll get too thin, etc. And there will be all kinds of complications. Even exercise. If you're, your doctor may say, oh, well, you need more exercise. And so you go out and do that. But, your doctor might also say something like, well, okay, well, take it easy. You might have a certain kind of condition where you can't put that much stress on your muscles or your joints or whatever. You'll end up causing more damage because you have too much of it. So your doctor could say to you, look, the source of your health is going to be food and exercise, but, you got to listen. You got to do it in the right amount. Too little will be a deficiency, will be something bad for your health. And, of course, too much, again, it will be an excess, and it'll be too bad. So Aristotle is kind of saying, look, you're dealt certain cards. You got to play them correctly. You don't just there isn't sort of a single thing that will lead to virtue and other things lead to vice. No, as a matter of fact, the same things can lead to virtues and vices, or excesses and deficiencies and all these things. And it's up to us to regulate, to get the right amount. So remember, you're acting in accord with a correct principle, a right reason. So you got to be careful in how you do these things. All right, so you play the cards right, and the activities that come also corrupt them, as I've mentioned. But there's another thing, that the things that help us develop the virtues, there's a kind of feedback loop. So if you recall, I always think of the sort of the example to help with this second point of Aristotle is they develop and the single source develops and damages, but this source has sort of a feedback. So through this development of yourself with your health, for instance, if the more you get it in the right amount, the easier it is to get it in the right amount. So think of that sort of corny old movie Rocky, about the boxer who eventually he's sort of kind of a down and out boxer. He's in terrible shape, and he gets an opportunity to fight the world champion. Okay, without going into the story, but one thing that's an interesting point is at the beginning of this training. The beginning of when Rocky starts training, there's this montage to show the passage of time, as they tend to do in films. But this montage it starts off with him cracking a bunch of raw eggs into a glass and then drinking it, which is not a safe thing to do at all. But in any case, it was for protein. So he starts off he can barely get out of bed in the morning. At this crack of dawn, he's struggling to get out of bed, and then he struggles to even crack the eggs, and he barely chokes it back, and then he goes out for a run. And he can barely run because he's terrible shape. And they show him, he can run a little bit at the beginning, but by the time he gets in the morning to the end of his run and he's running up the steps in someplace, I think it's in Philadelphia, and he can barely get up the steps. He's struggling, he's panicking, he's just covered in sweat, and he can barely get through his jogging in the morning. Well, the montage, so often there's kind of another sort of little scene in the montage, and what's happening? Well, eventually he's jumping out of bed, right? Boom, he's getting up, he runs to the kitchen, he slams this egg drink in the morning, and bolts out the door, and he's running, and of course they got the music jacked up, and so, but the point is that as he keeps training, he gets better at it and better at it and better at it and better at it. And then, he's, instead of struggling to get up the steps, he's like just sprinting up them, taking them 2, 3, 4 at a time, and then dancing around top of the world kind of thing as he goes along. So the point is that there is shall we say, a feedback loop here. That the more you do this in the right amount, the easier it becomes to do it in the right amount. So it's, it took me a long time to get used to jogging or some form of exercise, but after I got into it and it wasn't so painful and I got a little stronger, it became kind of enjoyable. It became actually kind of pleasant until the point where people say, oh, I look forward to my morning run, whereas, like me, I would dread it, but I would imagine if I did it a lot, I would get into it, it would be easier, and eventually I'd be kind of, like Rocky, running around like crazy in the morning and feeling strong now, as they say in the movie. So this feedback loop also applies to the character virtues. So when we're talking about the development of our characters, the whole notion of habituation, the ethos, the habit that develops the ethos of the character virtues, those are something that they just get easier. Aristotle was also influenced a lot by military thought. That's another topic. Socrates and Plato too. Plato's got dialogue. Socrates himself was a soldier. He was a hoplite. And they did notice that training deeply changed people. Think about how people can be trained they're put in terribly stressful and fearful situations over and over and over again as part of their training until eventually they can completely keep calm in a very stressful type of atmosphere, which is what you want for soldiers and police officers, that they can keep their cool. But how do they manage to do that? Well, that's not just by throwing people into a highly stressful situation without training. That's a disaster. The idea goes along with this whole thing of a feedback loop is you develop the right kind of character in order to withstand those situations. You have the strength and all that, just like you develop the strength in order to handle jogging. You develop the character virtue strength in order to be in stressful situations without overreacting. So there's a few general observations. So if you do brave things, you'll be disposed. You will have a tendency. You will have the kind of disposition that will make you the type of person who can do brave things and who doesn't find it that difficult to do brave things. So the difficulty level starts to go down with sporting activities and with trying to be a good person. It gets easier over time if you do it, if you become habituated. It gets easier and easier and easier to be a good person until the point where it becomes effortless. Not where you're sort of like a zombie, just a good zombie walking around doing good things. No, Aristotle wants to avoid that, and we'll see how he does it a little later. But you become habituated where it just becomes the type of person you are. So this is an ethics of being. The type of character you have will be a good character, and that's all constructed through habituation. Okay, so that's the first couple of chapters. Stay tuned and we'll dig more deeply into this.